Hello friends, and welcome back to the Green Hack. This morning, I want to tell you about one of the simplest gardening mistakes I made for years. Looking back, I wish I had learned this lesson much sooner. For years, I threw away something my tomatoes desperately needed. Every morning, I would make breakfast, crack a few eggs into a pan, and toss the shells straight into the trash. It was such a simple habit that I never stopped to question it. To me, they were just kitchen waste, nothing more. Looking back now, I realize how many opportunities I threw away without even knowing it. Around that same time, I was putting a lot of effort into growing tomatoes in my backyard. Tomatoes have always been one of my favorite crops because there is nothing quite like picking a ripe tomato straight from the vine on a warm summer morning. But one season, things did not go the way I expected. My plants were growing, but they did not seem as strong as they had in previous years. Some fruits developed dark spots on the bottom, others never seemed to reach their full potential. I tried watering more carefully, I paid closer attention to the weather. I checked for signs of pests, yet the problem kept showing up. It was frustrating because I felt like I was doing everything right. Every morning I would walk through the garden, coffee in hand, looking at those tomato plants and wondering what I was missing. The strange part was that the answer was sitting only a few feet away in my kitchen. At the time, I had no idea. Like many gardeners, I assumed that if a plant needed help, the solution had to come from a bag at the garden center. I never imagined that something I threw away every day could play a role in the garden. Then one afternoon, while talking with another gardener who had been growing vegetables much longer than I had, the conversation took an unexpected turn. He listened to me describe my tomato problems, nodded for a moment, and then asked a simple question. "What do you do with your eggshells?" I remember laughing because it seemed completely unrelated. I told him exactly what most people would say. "I throw them away." He smiled and said, "Maybe you shouldn't." At that moment, I had no idea that a simple kitchen scrap was about to change the way I looked at gardening forever. And honestly, I wish I had learned that lesson years earlier. After that conversation, I could not stop thinking about what he had said. The question sounded so simple, yet it stayed with me for days. What do you do with your eggshells? At first, I was skeptical. I had always associated healthy plants with fertilizers, soil amendments, and products designed specifically for gardening. Eggshells seemed too ordinary, too simple. But the more I thought about it, the more curious I became. Around that time, my tomato plants were still struggling with the same problems. Some fruits developed dark, sunken spots at the bottom. Others seemed smaller than they should have been. The plants survived, but they were not thriving. Every gardener knows that feeling. You put in the effort, you water consistently, you watch the weather, you care about every plant, yet something still feels off. That was exactly where I found myself. One evening, I walked through the garden and looked closely at my tomato plants. I noticed that the problem was not affecting every fruit equally. Some looked perfectly healthy, others clearly did not. It reminded me that gardening is rarely about finding one magic solution. Most of the time, it is about paying attention to small details. The next morning, while making breakfast, I looked at the eggshells in my hand differently for the first time. Instead of seeing trash, I started wondering if there might be something useful hidden inside them. That simple shift in perspective changed everything. The truth is, many of us overlook things because they are too familiar. We assume valuable solutions must be expensive, complicated, or difficult to find. But gardening has taught me the opposite lesson again and again. Some of the best solutions are already sitting right in front of us, we just do not recognize them yet. As I continued researching and talking with experienced gardeners, I learned that eggshells had been used in home gardens for generations. Long before modern products filled store shelves, gardeners found ways to reuse what they already had. Suddenly, the idea did not seem strange anymore. In fact, it started to make perfect sense. So instead of throwing my next batch of eggshells into the trash, I decided to try something different. I did not expect a miracle. I was not looking for a shortcut. I simply wanted to see if this old gardening habit still had value today. And that small experiment became the beginning of a lesson I will never forget. Once I decided to stop throwing away my eggshells, the next question was simple. What exactly should I do with them? I quickly discovered that the process was much easier than I expected. There were no expensive tools to buy, no complicated recipes to memorize, and no special equipment hiding in the garage. In fact, everything started with the same eggshells that had been ending up in my trash can for years. The first thing I did was rinse them thoroughly after breakfast. I wanted to remove any remaining egg residue before storing them. After that, I placed the shells in a small container near a sunny window and allowed them to dry completely. Over time, the container slowly filled up. Every few days, another handful of eggshells joined the collection. It became a simple routine that required almost no effort. Once I had accumulated enough shells, I crushed them into smaller pieces. Sometimes I used my hands. Other times I used a simple kitchen tool to break them down further. I was not aiming for perfection. I simply wanted pieces small enough to mix into the soil around my tomato plants. What I liked most about the process was how practical it felt. Instead of throwing something away, I was giving it a second purpose. Gardening often teaches us to think differently about everyday items, and this was one of those moments. A bucket, a leaf, a piece of cardboard, or an eggshell can become part of the garden if you look at it the right way. When planting new tomatoes, I mixed some crushed eggshells into the planting area. For established plants, I gently worked a small amount into the soil around the base of each plant. Then I continued gardening exactly as I always had. I watered when needed, I monitored the plants, I watched the weather, nothing else changed. That is an important point because I was not trying to create a miracle treatment. I was simply adding one small habit to a routine I already followed. Looking back, I think that is one reason so many gardeners appreciate this method. It is simple. It is affordable, and it uses something that most households already have. There is a certain satisfaction that comes from turning kitchen scraps into something useful. Every time I saved another eggshell, I felt like I was investing a tiny bit back into the garden. At the time, I still had no idea whether it would make a noticeable difference, but I was about to find out. The hardest part of gardening has always been patience. We live in a world where people expect quick results, but gardens rarely work that way. After adding crushed eggshells to my tomato beds, I did not wake up the next morning and find giant tomatoes hanging from the vines. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. In fact, for the first few weeks, everything looked exactly the same. If I had been expecting some kind of miracle, I probably would have been disappointed. But gardening has taught me that the most meaningful changes often happen slowly, almost quietly, until one day you realize something is different. As the season continued, I began noticing small improvements. The plants seemed more consistent in their growth. New leaves looked healthy and vibrant. The overall appearance of the garden felt stronger and more balanced. What caught my attention most was that some of the problems I had struggled with in previous seasons appeared less frequently. The tomatoes looked healthier. The plants seemed more resilient during periods of heat and changing weather. Nothing was perfect, but things were moving in the right direction. Every few days, I found myself walking through the garden and paying closer attention. I would stop beside a tomato plant, look at the developing fruit, and compare it to what I remembered from previous years. Gardening has a way of teaching observation. The longer you do it, the more you notice small details that once escaped your attention. And little by little, I started to feel that this simple habit of saving eggshells was contributing something positive to the garden. What surprised me most was not the eggshells themselves. It was the reminder that good gardening is often built on small decisions repeated over time. We sometimes search for one big solution, when what truly makes a difference is a collection of simple habits. Watering consistently, improving soil gradually, paying attention to plant health, learning from experience. The eggshells became part of that larger picture. By late summer, I looked across my tomato patch and felt something I had not felt earlier in the season. Confidence. The plants looked healthier than before. The harvest was more satisfying. And while I cannot say that eggshells solved every problem in my garden, I can honestly say they became one of the easiest and most worthwhile habits I ever adopted. That was the moment I realized I had been throwing away something valuable for years without even knowing it. Sometimes the best gardening lessons are not about discovering something new. Sometimes they are about seeing familiar things in a completely different way. By the end of that season, I had learned something far more important than what to do with eggshells. The truth is, this story was never really about eggshells at all. It started there, but the lesson went much deeper. One of the reasons I love gardening is because it constantly reminds me to slow down and pay attention. In a world that encourages us to buy more, replace more, and move faster, the garden often teaches the opposite. It teaches patience, it teaches observation, and sometimes it teaches us that value can be hiding in places we rarely think to look. For years, I saw eggshells as waste because that was how I had always seen them. I never stopped to ask whether they still had a purpose. Looking back, I realize how often we do that in other parts of life as well. We become so familiar with something that we stop noticing its value. A simple conversation, an old gardening tip, a quiet morning in the backyard, even the small routines that shape our days. Sometimes the things we overlook are the things that matter most. That season reminded me that gardening is not about finding perfect solutions, it is about learning. Every year brings new successes, new mistakes, and new lessons. Some lessons come from books, some come from experienced gardeners. And some arrive unexpectedly while standing in your kitchen holding a handful of eggshells. What matters is staying curious enough to learn from them. These days, I still save my eggshells. It has become one of those small habits that takes almost no effort but keeps me connected to the garden. Every time I place another shell into the container by the window, I am reminded that useful things are often closer than we think. The garden has a way of turning ordinary things into something meaningful. As I look across my tomato patch today, I do not see perfect plants. I see seasons of learning. I see mistakes that taught valuable lessons. I see simple habits that gradually improve the garden over time, and perhaps that is the real reward of gardening, not just the harvest at the end of the season, but the wisdom gathered along the way. Thank you for spending part of your day with me. If you have ever used eggshells in your garden, I would love to hear about your experience in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and join us for more simple gardening ideas here on The Green Hack. Until next time, keep growing, keep learning, and keep finding value in the things others might overlook.